She told him to leave his own house so her new lover could move in, not a rental, not a shared property, not something they built together. The house he purchased with 9 years of his own savings, 14 months before he ever put a ring on her finger. The house where he planted a magnolia in the front yard the spring before their wedding. The house where his name, and only his name, had sat on the deed for 8 years, while she threw dinner parties and called it hers. She sat him down in his own living room, with her mother on the settee and her boyfriend already measuring the guest room with his eyes, and she told a quiet man to be gone in 2 weeks. He looked at his wife. He looked at her mother. He looked at the man sitting in his chair. He nodded once. He said nothing. He went upstairs and made a cup of tea. And that, right there, was her first mistake. Because what she did not know, what she had never once thought to ask in 8 years of marriage, was what else that quiet man had been holding on to. What he owned. What he'd signed. What had been sitting in a drawer at his cousin's law office, notarized and patient, and accruing interest, just waiting for a moment exactly like this one. If you are new here, welcome. Hit that like button before this story is over, because I promise you, you are going to want to rewind it, subscribe so you never miss what we drop next, and drop your city in the comments right now. I want to know where in the world you're watching this story unfold. Now let me take you all the way back to a Sunday evening in October, to a wraparound porch in Buckhead, Atlanta, and a man pulling into his own driveway to find a stranger's car parked where his truck should be. The car was a silver Mercedes parked at an angle that took up more of the driveway than it needed to. Teddy noticed that first. Not the car itself, not the plates, not even whose it was, just the angle. The particular arrogance of a man who parks like the space was already his. Theodore Graves pulled his Silverado to the curb and sat for a moment with the engine idling. The porch light was on, the living room windows were warm and bright. From the outside, 14 Harlan Court looked exactly like what it was. A well-kept home on a quiet Buckhead street, 4 bedrooms, wraparound porch, a magnolia in the front yard that had grown from a sapling he'd planted with his own hands the spring of 2015. He'd put it there before Renata had ever walked through the front door. He'd put everything there before Renata walked through the front door. But that was a detail she had never found interesting enough to remember. He cut the engine. He got out. He walked up the path he'd had relaid 2 summers ago because the original stones had begun to shift, and a crooked foundation offended something deep in his nature. He was a man who fixed things before they failed. Always had been. He opened the front door and walked into his living room. There were 3 of them. Renata was on the sofa, his sofa, in his living room, in the house he'd bought with 9 years of his own earnings, sitting upright and composed, the way she always sat when she had decided something and was simply waiting to deliver it. She was wearing the bone-colored blazer she saved for client presentations. She had dressed for this. Teddy registered that and said nothing. Claudette Holloway, Renata's mother, was in the armchair to the left with a glass of sweet tea and her arms folded across her chest like a woman presiding over a verdict she'd already written. She did not look up when Teddy entered. She did not need to look up. In Claudette's mind, a man like Teddy did not require acknowledgement until it was time to dismiss him. And then there was the third one. He was sitting in the chair by the window. Teddy's reading chair, the one he'd had since before the marriage, the one with the worn armrest on the left side from years of resting a chess clock on it. He was tall, well-dressed, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the particular ease of a man who had never spent a single night wondering whether he belonged in a room. He did not stand when Teddy walked in. He didn't introduce himself. He simply sat there in Teddy's chair and looked at Teddy the way a man looks at furniture he's planning to replace. Teddy had seen Prescott Bridges before, at firm events, in passing, in the background of photographs Renata posted without tagging anyone. He knew the name. He had known the name for longer than Renata probably imagined. Renata spoke first. She told him she wanted a divorce. She told him the firm was thriving, that she and Prescott had reached an understanding that was both professional and personal, and that she needed Teddy out of the house within 2 weeks. She had a timeline. She said the word timeline like it was a kindness she was extending to him. She said Prescott would be moving in and that the transition would go more smoothly if Teddy did not make it complicated. She did not raise her voice. She did not waver. She delivered the whole thing like a quarterly report. Clear, structured, already decided. Claudette set her sweet tea on the side table and finally looked at him. She said that Teddy had never been in Renata's league and that any honest man would admit it. She said he ought to be grateful for the years Renata had given him. She said she hoped he would handle this with some dignity, as though dignity were a quality she had ever once extended to him in 8 years of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings and quiet conversations in which she had spoken about him in the third person while he was standing in the room. Teddy stood in the doorway of his living room and looked at his wife. He looked at his mother-in-law. He looked at the man in his chair, who had still not stood up, who was now glancing around the room with the slow, assessing gaze of someone deciding where to put things. Teddy nodded once. He did not say a word. He turned, walked through the kitchen. The kitchen with the window over the sink that looked out onto the front yard, where the magnolia was visible in the October evening light, its leaves gone deep and dark with the turning of the season. And he filled the kettle and set it on the burner. He stood at that window while the water heated. He looked at the tree he had planted. He thought about the deed that bore his name. He thought about a document signed at that very kitchen table 8 years ago by a woman who had not bothered to read it. He thought about a folder in his cousin Darlene's office on Peachtree Center Avenue, organized and complete and waiting the way a man waits when he already knows how a thing is going to end. The kettle began to whistle. Teddy reached up and took down his mug, the plain blue one, the one nobody else used, and he made his tea. And the house around him was quiet and settled, and entirely his. To understand why Theodore Graves stood at that kitchen window without flinching, you have to go back. You have to go back before Renata, before the dinner parties and the firm and the man in the reading chair. You have to go back to the version of Teddy Graves that existed before anyone thought to dismiss him. He grew up in Vine City, the second son of Raymond Graves, who worked facilities management, and Lorraine Graves, who taught 4th grade at a school 6 blocks from the house where she raised her boys. They were not wealthy people. They were something better than wealthy. They were disciplined. Raymond Graves paid every bill on time and never once borrowed money he did not intend to return. He passed that disposition to Teddy the way some fathers pass down tempers or bad habits. Quietly, completely, without making a ceremony of it. Teddy studied civil engineering at Georgia Tech on a partial scholarship and a lot of early mornings. He graduated, went to work, and spent the next 9 years doing what Raymond Graves had taught him to do. He built things correctly, and he saved what he earned. No flash, no performance, just work, deposit, repeat. By the fall of 2015, at 32 years old, Theodore Marcus Graves had $410,000 in a personal savings account that nobody knew about because nobody had thought to ask. He bought 14 Harlan Court on October 14, 2015. He paid cash for the down payment and took a 15-year mortgage on the remainder with his name, only his name, on every document. He spent 2 weekends painting the porch. He planted the magnolia himself, just off the front walk, because he liked the idea of something living marking the entrance to a place he had built from nothing. He was not thinking about divorce when he did it. He was not thinking about protection or legal strategy or the future uses of pre-marital separate property. He was just a 32-year-old man planting a tree in front of his house because it pleased him to do so. He met Renata Holloway 4 months later at a mutual friend's birthday dinner in Midtown. She was radiant and quick and had a way of holding a room's attention that Teddy found genuinely impressive rather than threatening. She was building something, she told him. She had a vision for a design firm that would serve Atlanta's luxury residential market from the inside out. She had the talent and the taste and the drive. She just needed the right conditions to launch. Teddy listened. He asked good questions. He found her fascinating. They were married in December of 2016 in a ceremony at a venue in Buckhead that Renata had selected and Teddy had paid for. He did not mind. He was proud to have a wife who knew what she wanted and was not shy about wanting it. He believed at that time that her ambition and his steadiness were complementary things. He was wrong about that, but it would take years for the wrongness to become undeniable. The erosion was so gradual that it barely registered as movement at first. It started at firm events within the first year of the marriage. Renata would introduce him to clients and colleagues with a vague gesture and a half-sentence. "This is my husband." The way you might mention a piece of furniture that came with the house. No profession mentioned, no context offered. When someone would press and ask what Teddy did, Renata would answer for him. Infrastructure, government contracts, the behind-the-scenes kind of work. She always said it with a warm smile. She always said it in a tone that made it sound like a gentle compliment while removing every detail that might make him interesting. Teddy noticed. He refilled people's glasses and changed the subject and said nothing. Claudette arrived in their lives with increasing frequency beginning around year 2. She would come for a weekend and stay for 2 weeks. She had opinions about the furniture arrangement and the kitchen organization, and the way Renata was not being fully appreciated in certain professional circles, opinions she delivered loudly and often at the dinner table in a house that she had begun referring to as Renata's place without ever stopping to consider why Teddy's name did not appear anywhere on the listing she had never looked up. Renata began calling it her house around year 3. Not to Teddy directly, to guests, to clients who came for dinner, to her college roommate who visited one spring and spent the whole weekend complimenting the finishes. Renata walked that woman through every room like a docent, explaining her choices, her vision, the specific quality of light in the afternoon through the west-facing windows. She said my house the way a person says it when the ownership is so obvious it barely needs stating. Teddy was in the kitchen, warming bread, the night she said it in front of a table full of her firm's best clients. He heard it clearly. He set the bread on the counter, walked back to the dining room, and topped off everyone's wine without a word. One of the clients, a woman named Paulette who ran a hotel group out of Alpharetta, looked at Teddy as he poured and gave him a small private smile, the kind that said she understood more than she was supposed to. Later that same year, at the firm's holiday party, at a rooftop venue in Buckhead, Renata was mid-conversation with 2 prospective clients when Teddy approached with a fresh round of drinks. She turned to him, laughed lightly, and said, "Oh, that's just my background." The clients laughed. Renata laughed. Teddy smiled, set down the drinks and walked back toward the bar. He thought about the deed. He thought about the magnolia. He thought about a man who plants something and then simply waits for the season to turn. He was very patient. He had always been very patient. and Renata had no idea what she was planting right alongside him. The firm began at the kitchen table. That was the detail Renata would spend the next 6 years carefully omitting from every version of the founding story she told. In interviews, at client dinners, at the industry luncheons where she accepted awards for entrepreneurial vision, she described starting Holloway and Bridges the way people describe surviving something. Through grit, through instinct, through the particular courage of a woman who simply refused to work for anyone else's dream when she had her own. She said it well, she said it often, and not one word of it accounted for the $280,000 that made the whole thing possible. In the early months of 2016, Renata had the vision and the skill, but not the capital. She had a business plan that Teddy had read twice and found genuinely impressive. She had a potential partner in Prescott Bridges, a developer-turned-designer who had the industry connections she lacked and the business instincts to match her creative ones. What she needed was money, and she needed it quickly before the commercial lease on the Peachtree Road studio space was taken by someone else. Teddy talked to Darlene. Darlene drafted a private loan agreement in 2 weeks, clean, legal, notarized, structured as a convertible note at 4.5% annual interest. The terms were straightforward. Teddy would lend Renata $280,000 to fund the firm's launch. At any point, at his sole election, he could choose to convert that loan into a 38% equity stake in Holloway and Bridges rather than accept repayment. He had no obligation to convert. He had no deadline to convert. The choice was entirely his for as long as the note existed. Darlene brought the documents to the house on a Tuesday evening in March. Renata was distracted, excited, already 3 conversations deep into plans for the studio layout and the client acquisition strategy she had been refining for months. She sat at the kitchen table with the papers in front of her and a pen in her hand, and she signed where Darlene indicated, while Teddy stood at the counter making coffee. She did not read the document. Not the first page, not the last page, not the clause on page 4 that described the conversion option in plain, unambiguous language. She signed it the way people sign things they consider a formality, quickly, with confidence, without curiosity. Teddy set a mug of coffee in front of her when she was done. He did not say anything about what she had just agreed to. He never would. Holloway and Bridges opened that April, and it was good. Teddy would give Renata that without hesitation. Even now, she was extraordinary at what she did. Within 18 months, the firm had completed 14 residential projects, 3 of which were featured in regional design publications. Within 3 years, they were among the most sought-after interior design firms in Atlanta's luxury market. Renata's name was in the right mouths. The studio on Peachtree Road hummed with the specific energy of a business that had found its footing and was beginning to run. And Prescott Bridges was running right alongside her. He had come into the firm as a co-founder with industry contacts and no capital, a deliberate arrangement that left Teddy's loan as the founding financial event, uncredited and invisible. Prescott was charming in the way that useful men often are. He wore expensive shoes and knew which restaurants to suggest for client meetings and laughed at the right moments during presentations. Claudette, who had never found much to say about Teddy at family gatherings, began referring to Prescott as a real businessman. She said it at Thanksgiving the year the firm's revenue crossed $2 million. She said it again at Easter. She said it with a particular emphasis that made it impossible to miss what she was comparing him to. Teddy passed the rolls and said nothing. The working dinners began sometime in year 4. Prescott would arrive at Harlan Court on a Thursday evening with his laptop and a bottle of wine he'd selected, with the careful casualness of a man who wanted to seem at home and he and Renata would spread project files across the dining room table while Teddy watched a game in the other room or sat on the porch with a chess problem. Nobody asked Teddy to join them. Nobody acknowledged when he went to bed. The house had become a stage for a life he was no longer cast in, and everyone seemed to understand this, except, officially, him. He noticed the ring 4 months before the anniversary. A tan line where it had been, faint but unmistakable on her left hand. He said nothing about that either. But the following week, quietly and without explanation, he called Darlene and asked her to begin forwarding his personal mail to her office address on Peachtree Center Avenue. Darlene asked no questions. She simply said she would take care of it. The last Saturday before everything changed, Teddy spent the afternoon in the garage working on a table. It was a good piece, solid oak, estate sale find from a house in Decatur, the finish worn down to bare wood in places from decades of use. He stripped it back, sanded it even, and began laying down a new coat of stain in long, deliberate strokes. He had no way of knowing on that afternoon that Renata would eventually sit across that table and try to dismantle the life he had built. He was just a man refinishing a table because a good thing deserved to be restored. That was the kind of man Teddy Graves had always been. Graves' legal group occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower on Peachtree Center Avenue, and on a Wednesday morning in October, Theodore Graves rode the elevator up with a single manila folder tucked under his arm, and the particular stillness of a man who has already decided what he is going to do. Darlene was waiting. She was seated behind her desk when her assistant showed Teddy in, and she did not stand, and she did not make small talk, because Darlene Graves had not built her practice on small talk. She was 50 years old, and she had been a lawyer for 22 of them, and she had the kind of face that gave nothing away until she was ready to give it. She had drafted the convertible note 8 years ago. She had kept every document since. And when Teddy called her Sunday evening and asked if he could come in Wednesday morning, she had simply said yes and set aside the whole morning without asking why. He sat down across from her and set the folder on the desk. She opened it, looked through it briefly and nodded once. Then she pulled 2 sets of documents from her own files and laid them out side by side. The first was the deed to 14 Harlan Court. She walked him through it in 2 sentences. The property had been purchased on October 14, 2015. The sole owner of record was Theodore Marcus Graves. Renata's name appeared nowhere on the deed, nowhere on the mortgage, nowhere in the chain of title. Under Georgia law, property acquired before marriage with documented separate funds remained the sole property of the acquiring spouse. Renata had contributed nothing to the purchase. She had no legal claim to the property, not a partial claim, not a negotiating position, nothing. Darlene moved to the second document without pausing. The original convertible note, dated March of 2016, notarized and fully executed, showed a principal amount of $280,000 lent by Theodore Marcus Graves to Holloway and Bridges Interior Design. It had been accruing interest at 4.5% annually for 8 years. The current total obligation, including interest, was $398,000. Renata could repay that amount in full within 90 days of election, or Teddy could choose to convert, meaning instead of cash, he would receive a 38% equity stake in the firm. 38%. Darlene explained what that meant with the precision of someone who had been thinking about it since Sunday. The firm's current ownership structure split the remaining 62% between Renata and Prescott roughly in half. A 38% stake would make Theodore Graves the largest single shareholder in Holloway and Bridges Interior Design. It would trigger the shareholder agreement, a document Renata had also signed without reading, giving the holder of that stake the right to appoint 1 board seat and critically, the authority to approve or deny any firm transaction exceeding $50,000. Teddy sat with that for a moment. He thought about the gala Renata had mentioned at dinner 3 months ago, the one she had been planning with the kind of focused excitement she reserved for things she considered genuinely important. The expansion announcement, the second studio, the $210,000 lease commitment that was going to be the headline of the evening. He thought about Prescott, who had already signed a personal guarantee on the second studio space. He thought about the woman who had told him to be out of his own house in 2 weeks, and the mother who had told him he should be grateful, and the man in his reading chair who had not stood up when Teddy walked in. Darlene watched him think. She did not rush him. After a moment she asked him what he wanted to do. Teddy looked at the deed. He looked at the note. He looked at the numbers laid out with the clean certainty of documents that had been waiting patiently for exactly this conversation. He asked her how long the conversion would take to process and serve. Darlene said she could have the notice prepared and sent certified mail by end of week. She said the divorce petition asserting sole ownership of the property could be filed simultaneously, or staggered. His choice. Teddy thought about that. Then he said he wanted the conversion first. He wanted Renata and Prescott to receive the equity notice, to absorb it, to try to understand what it meant for the expansion and the gala and everything they had been building toward. He wanted that to land before the divorce filing arrived and made the rest of it clear. And then he said quietly, he wanted the repayment too. Not instead of conversion. After. He wanted to convert, sit in the shareholder seat long enough to block the expansion, and then, once the divorce was finalized, call in the full $398,000. He wanted them to feel both things, in sequence. Darlene looked at him for a moment. Then she opened her legal pad and began to write. The slow burn was over. From this Wednesday morning forward, everything would move fast, and Theodore Graves, who had spent 8 years being the quietest man in every room, had just given the order to begin. Darlene did not waste Thursday morning. By the time Teddy arrived at her office at 1 in the afternoon, she had already drafted both sets of initiating documents and arranged them in the precise order they would be executed. She walked him through the strategy the way she walked through all strategies, sequentially, without editorializing, with the calm efficiency of a woman who had been thinking 3 moves ahead since Sunday evening. 2 moves, she said. That was all this required. Move 1 was the equity conversion notice, a formal election letter on Graves' legal group letterhead sent certified mail to Holloway & Bridges Interior Design, notifying the firm that Theodore Marcus Graves was exercising his right under the convertible note dated March 2016 to convert the outstanding principal and accrued interest into a 38% equity stake. The letter would also invoke the shareholder agreement clause, which required Teddy's written approval for any firm transaction exceeding $50,000. Darlene had confirmed that the gala was scheduled for Friday evening. The expansion announcement was the centerpiece of the event. The lease commitment Prescott had personally guaranteed was $210,000. When the letter arrived Monday morning, Prescott's personal guarantee on that empty building would already be active. Move 2 was the divorce petition. 40 pages asserting that 14 Harlan Court was the sole pre-marital separate property of Theodore Marcus Graves, purchased 14 months before the marriage using exclusively documented personal funds, and therefore entirely ineligible for equitable distribution under Georgia law. No negotiating language, no settlement offers embedded in the filing, just the facts, laid out with the clean certainty of a deed that had always borne one name. Darlene recommended the conversion notice go first. Let them absorb that. Let the gala happen. Let the expansion collapse in public. And then on Friday, let the petition arrive at Renata's attorney's office like a second weather system moving in behind the first. Teddy agreed. He signed both sets of initiating documents at Darlene's conference table at 20 minutes past 1 on a Thursday afternoon, using the same steady hand he used to sign off on engineering specifications. No hesitation, no visible emotion. He signed the conversion election first, then the divorce petition authorization, and then he capped the pen and set it on the table. Darlene told him she would handle the rest. The letters would go out Sunday evening, certified, return receipt requested. She would call him when confirmation came back. Teddy thanked her. He drove home. He spent the rest of Thursday and all of Friday at the house, working, cooking, moving through the rooms with the unhurried ease of a man who knew exactly where he stood. He made a pot of red beans on Friday evening and ate at the kitchen table, alone, listening to a late-season baseball game on the radio, and the house was quiet around him, in the way it was quiet when it was simply itself. Not a stage set, not a status symbol, just four walls and a solid foundation on a good street in Buckhead, owned outright by the man eating beans at the kitchen table. He did not call Renata, he did not text, he had nothing to say. Saturday morning, while Teddy sat on the back porch with a chess problem and a second cup of coffee, Renata and Prescott posted a photograph together on social media. They were at a restaurant in Midtown. Candle-lit table, his hand over hers, her smile directed at the camera with the particular precision of a woman who knew exactly how she photographed. The caption said something about new beginnings. Within 2 hours it had gathered dozens of comments, most of them congratulatory, several of them from women Claudette attended church with, one of them from Claudette herself, who wrote simply, "My daughter deserves all of this and more." Teddy did not see the post. He was still on the porch working a Sicilian defense problem, drinking his coffee while it was still hot. By Sunday afternoon, Claudette's church circle had been fully informed that Renata and Prescott would be moving into the Buckhead place as soon as the paperwork was sorted. One of the women called it a beautiful home. Claudette agreed, and did not correct the description or examine the assumption that underlined it. Sunday evening, Teddy drove to the post office on Peachtree Road, parked, and walked 2 certified envelopes to the counter. He handed them across without ceremony. He took his receipts, he drove home, he made a cup of tea. He took it to the front porch. The October wind had picked up since the afternoon, and the magnolia was moving in it. Slow, heavy sweeps of dark leaves catching the porch light from below. The way the tree had moved in October winds for 8 years, rooted in the same earth, unhurried, going nowhere. Teddy watched it for a long while. Everything was already in motion. The letters were in the postal system. The documents were filed. The plan was not a plan anymore. It was a clock, and it was running. Teddy finished his tea. He went inside. He locked his front door. Monday morning, the letters would land. The first letter arrived on a Monday morning. It came certified, return receipt requested, on Graves Legal Group letterhead, addressed to Holloway, and Bridges Interior Design, attention, both founding partners. The front desk associate signed for it at 9:17. Renata and Prescott were both already in the studio. Renata opened it. She read the first paragraph standing at the reception desk, in front of 2 junior designers who had come in early to prep for the gala. Her face did not change immediately. It changed slowly, the way a structure changes when something load-bearing has been removed. Not all at once, but with the particular stillness that comes just before collapse. Theodore Marcus Graves had elected to convert. Effective immediately, he held 38% of Holloway and Bridges Interior Design, the largest single equity stake in the firm. Per the shareholder agreement triggered by conversion, his written approval was required for all firm transactions exceeding $50,000. The letter was dated the previous Friday. It had been in transit all weekend while they were posting photographs at candlelit restaurants and telling Claudette's church circle about the Buckhead place. Prescott read it over Renata's shoulder. He went very still. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. The two junior designers found somewhere else to be. By noon, Renata's attorney had contacted Darlene's office to request approval for the $210,000 second studio expansion, framed as an urgent matter given the gala timeline. Darlene's response arrived in writing 4 hours later. 2 sentences. Theodore Graves declined to approve the transaction. No further explanation was provided. The expansion was dead. Wednesday came like a wall. The gala was held at a venue in Midtown that Renata had booked 3 months earlier, the kind of space with high ceilings and warm lighting, and a catering team that knew how to make a room feel like an occasion. 112 guests, 4 prospective clients who had come specifically to witness the expansion announcement and sign preliminary agreements before the evening ended. Renata tried to pivot. She stood at the front of the room and reframed the evening as a celebration of the firm's existing achievements. The client portfolio, the industry recognition, the 8 years of work that had brought them to this point. She was composed. She was polished. She was, as always, very good in a room, but 2 of the 4 prospective clients left before the dessert course. A third approached Prescott directly near the end of the evening and asked plainly what had happened to the expansion. Prescott gave him an answer about internal restructuring that satisfied no one and invited 3 follow-up questions he could not cleanly answer. The third client did not sign anything. He left. Thursday morning, a reporter from Atlanta magazine called Darlene's office. The profile piece on Holloway and Bridges, already written, already edited, already scheduled to run the following Tuesday, needed a comment from all relevant parties before publication. The reporter explained she had become aware of a shareholder dispute, and her editor wanted the piece to reflect the current status of the firm. Darlene took the call herself. She provided a statement. 3 sentences. She confirmed that Theodore Graves held a 38% equity stake in Holloway and Bridges Interior Design, that this stake had been acquired through the lawful conversion of a private loan instrument dated 2016, and that matters related to the firm's governance were currently being addressed through appropriate legal channels. She thanked the reporter for reaching out. By end of day Thursday, the editor had killed the profile. The piece that was supposed to announce Holloway and Bridges to a new tier of Atlanta's luxury market. The piece Renata had been quoted in, photographed for, and had mentioned casually at 2 dinner parties as if its publication were already a form of victory, simply ceased to exist. Quietly. Without ceremony. Friday morning, the divorce petition arrived at Renata's attorney's office. Her attorney reviewed it in under an hour and called Renata at 11:45. The call lasted 7 minutes. When it ended, Renata sat at her desk in the Peachtree Road studio and looked at the wall with the specific expression of a person who has just been told that the ground they have been standing on was never ground at all. Renata called Prescott. She told him about the house. Prescott, who had already begun describing the Harlan Court property to colleagues as the place they were moving into, who had told at least one person which room he planned to use as a home office, heard this information in silence. Then he asked Renata to repeat it. She did. Claudette was in the room when Renata made that call. She heard everything, and for the first time in 8 years, Claudette Holloway who had a verdict ready for every occasion and a voice designed to fill every room, said absolutely nothing. She sat there, and she said nothing for 11 days. By Friday evening, Renata had scheduled an emergency partners meeting for the following Wednesday. She sent the notification to Teddy through Darlene's office, as legally required. Darlene replied within the hour. Theodore Graves would be in attendance. What Renata did not know, could not have known, was that Teddy had confirmed his attendance before she had even finished composing the message. He had been expecting the call. He had already decided where he was going to sit. Wednesday was coming, and Teddy Graves was already ready. He was already seated when she arrived. That was the first thing Renata saw when she pushed open the conference room door on that Wednesday afternoon. Teddy at the head of the table. Her conference table. The one she had been using for 6 years to run client presentations and staff reviews and the kind of meetings where she was always the most important person in the room. He was sitting at the head of it like he had been there all morning. Darlene was to his right, a leather portfolio closed in front of her, her expression exactly as neutral as it always was. There was a shareholder packet at every chair, 12 pages, tabbed and ordered, placed with the particular precision of someone who had thought carefully about the effect of walking into a room and finding your name on a document you did not expect. Prescott was there. He was standing near the window, his jacket on, his arms at his sides. He had not sat down. He would not sit down for the entire meeting. Claudette was not there. Renata noticed that absence the way you notice a sound that has suddenly stopped, the specific quiet where a voice used to be. For 8 years, Claudette had inserted herself into every significant moment of Renata's life. And today, the day it mattered most, her mother was nowhere in this building. Renata set her bag on the nearest chair and looked at Teddy. She asked him how he could do this. Her voice was controlled, but only just. The composure was there, but it was thin now, like ice in late March, and the listener could hear the effort it was costing her to maintain it. She said she had given him 8 years. She said she had built something real, and he was tearing it apart out of spite. Teddy let her finish. Then he let the silence sit for a long moment, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that fills a room the way water fills a vessel, slowly and completely. It was the first time in 8 years that the silence in a room belonged to him, and he let it belong to him. Then he spoke. He said he wanted to tell her something, and he was only going to say it once, and he needed her to hear it clearly. He told her that she had spent 8 years calling him background. He said she had done it at dinner parties, at firm events, at a holiday party, in front of clients who smiled politely and looked away. He said she had done it so often and so casually that he suspected she no longer heard herself doing it, that it had become, for her, simply a description of what he was. He told her that on the evening of their 8th anniversary, she had sat in his living room in his house, with another man, and she had told him to be gone in 2 weeks. She had not handed him a legal document. She had not made an offer. She had given him a timeline the way you give a timeline to someone who has no standing to negotiate. She had treated the house the way people treat things they are certain they own. He paused. He told her she had signed a document at his kitchen table 8 years ago and had not read a single word of it. He told her that while she signed it, he had been standing at the counter making her coffee. He told her the document gave him the right to own 38% of everything she had built at his sole election, at any time, for as long as the note existed. He told her that she had let her mother tell the women at her church that his house was Renata's property. He told her that Prescott had been measuring his rooms with his eyes from the moment he walked through the front door. He looked at her steadily. Then he said it. "You told me to leave a house with my name on the deed, and I said nothing because I didn't need to." The room was absolutely still. Renata's composure did not shatter. It did not break dramatically or loudly or all at once. It left her face the way color leaves something left too long in the sun, gradually, completely, without announcement. The precision she had worn for 8 years, the particular arrangement of her expression that said she was always the most prepared person in any room she entered, simply was no longer there. She looked, for the first time, like someone who understood what had happened to her. Prescott said Teddy's name. Just the one word? Flat, low, with no clear intention behind it. The utterance of a man who needed to say something and had nothing to say. Teddy did not look at him. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. One button, the way his father had taught him, the way a man finishes a thing cleanly before he walks away from it. He picked up his copy of the shareholder packet. He nodded once to Darlene. He walked out of the conference room and through the studio and past the reception desk and into the lobby where Renata had hung a framed print on the wall, a magnolia, dark leaves, white bloom, the kind of image people hang when they want to claim something beautiful as part of their story. He looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then he walked out onto Peachtree Road, got into his Silverado, and drove home to 14 Harlan Court without once looking back. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning in late January in a courtroom on Prior Street that smelled like old paper and central heating. Renata sat on one side with her attorney. Teddy sat on the other side with Darlene. The proceeding lasted 40 minutes. At the end of it, Theodore Marcus Graves walked out of that building as the sole legal owner of 14 Harlan Court, exactly as he had walked into the marriage. Renata received nothing from the house, not the fixtures she had selected, not the herb garden she had planted off the back porch, not a single dollar of the $410,000 that had purchased it before she ever lived there. Her attorney had filed 2 motions challenging the pre-marital separate property designation. Both were denied. The documentation was too clean, the timeline too clear, the deed too unambiguous. There was nothing left to argue. Teddy, rather than hold the equity stake, elected to call in the note, $398,000 due within 90 days. Holloway and Bridges had grown considerably in 6 years, but it had grown on a foundation that was now demanding repayment with interest. Every liquid asset the firm possessed went towards satisfying the obligation. Renata and Prescott restructured at a fraction of their former valuation, giving up the Peachtree Road studio for a smaller space and losing 4 of their 8 flagship clients in the process. Clients who cited instability and moved on without ceremony. The Atlanta magazine profile, of course, never ran. The second studio never opened. Prescott's personal liability on the empty building followed him into a civil judgment that appeared on his credit record and stayed there for 3 years like a signature he could not erase. Claudette Holloway stopped mentioning the Buckhead house at church. She stopped mentioning Teddy at all. The women in her circle, who had heard a great deal about Renata's beautiful home and her real businessman, heard nothing further on the subject and were tactful enough not to ask. Teddy moved back into 14 Harlan Court the week after the divorce was finalized. The first thing he did was open every window. The house had been sitting mostly empty, and it needed air and light, and the particular sound of a cold Atlanta morning moving through the rooms. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where Renata had signed a document she never read while he stood at the counter. and he drank it slowly, and he felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific peace of a man whose foundation has held. That spring, he filed the paperwork to establish the Raymond Graves Civil Engineering Fellowship at Morehouse College, 5 full scholarships annually, funded directly by the note repayment. First-generation college students from underserved Atlanta communities pursuing civil engineering degrees. The fellowship was named for his father, Raymond Graves, facilities manager, bill payer, teacher of quiet disciplines, because Teddy believed that the right way to honor what a man built was to make sure someone else got to build too. The first cohort of fellows was announced in September. That same month, Teddy had the back porch rebuilt and extended, adding a reading room off the garden with wide windows and a built-in bookshelf along the south wall. He did some of the finish work himself. He was that kind of man. He met Josephine Carter at the fellowship's inaugural luncheon in the spring, 16 months after the divorce. She was seated 2 chairs down at the faculty table, a structural architect from Carter Bell Design Engineering who had come as a guest of the Morehouse Engineering Department. She had opinions about the load calculations on the new Beltline Bridge extension and was not shy about sharing them with the engineer sitting across from her, who happened to agree with every point she made and told her so directly. She laughed when he said it. Not a polished laugh, a real one. She came to dinner at 14 Harlan Court 3 weeks later, and the house received her the way a well-built thing receives the right conditions. Without resistance, without adjustment, simply and completely. She stood in the kitchen and looked out the window at the magnolia and said it was a beautiful tree and asked how long it had been there. Teddy told her he planted it himself the spring before he moved in. She nodded, with the eye of someone who understood what it meant to choose the right thing for a foundation before anyone else arrives, to have opinions about it. They were right for each other in the way that solid things are right for each other. Here is what this story is about at its root. It is not about revenge. It is not about money or equity or the legal mechanics of premarital property. It is about what happens when someone spends years underestimating a person who was never weak, who was simply waiting for the moment when their strength needed to be used. Teddy Graves did not become powerful the day Renata told him to leave. He was already powerful. He had been powerful since before she walked through his door. She simply never asked. And that was always going to be her first mistake. Now let me ask you something. If you had been in Teddy's position, if someone had told you to leave a house with your name on the deed and you knew everything he knew, what would you have done? Would you have said something in that moment? Or would you have done exactly what Teddy did and let the silence do the work? Drop your answer in the comments right now. I genuinely want to know. And if this story moved you the way I think it did, hit that like button before you leave. It costs you nothing, and it means everything for getting these stories in front of the people who need to hear them. Subscribe if you are not already here, because there is another story coming, and I promise you it is going to be worth the wait. I will see you in the next one.